Imad, our next verse is now found in the New Testament, where Pastor Bohr tries to explain that John 14 and verse 16 really is one of those verses that to him clearly identifies a third individual, a third personal being. Let's go there. Let's hear what he has to say, and let's try and make sense of what the Bible is trying to say.
Notice John chapter 14 and verse 16. John chapter 14 and verse 16. Here Jesus is speaking about the outpouring of the Holy Spirit. Notice once again the idea of three. And I, this is Jesus, will pray the Father, there you have number two, and He will give you another helper. Who is that other helper? The Holy Spirit, right? That He may abide with you forever. Once again, John 14 verse 16 has three. I, the Father, and the helper, who is the Holy Spirit.
So clearly there, Imad, Pastor Bo is talking about the Comforter, the verse that says, and I will pray the Father, and He shall send you another Comforter. And so we have heard this one quite a number of times. And to me, to be honest, this is a verse that I used many years ago in defense of the Trinity. But when I accepted the truth about the Father and the Son, this was one of the easiest verses to actually understand, having just read the context. But please go ahead and share with us your thoughts on John 14 and verse 16.
Okay. Thank you for that, Virgil. Look, definitely in that verse, in John 14 verse 16, there are three mentioned, right? I will pray the Father who shall give you another comforter, right? There definitely are three. No one is denying that. But to jump to the conclusion that three are a trinity is really forcing your preconceived idea into the text and trying to make it to say something that it does not really say. So the question is, we know who the Father is. We know who the one who's speaking, it is Jesus. We understand that. But who is the Comforter, right? Now, I understand from Pastor Bo's perspective, the Comforter is a third person of the Godhead, which I don't have a problem with that terminology, but the way he places it is that it means it's a third separate being or person other than the Father and the Son, called God the Holy Spirit, which obviously we both of us, Virgil, have a problem with that. So what I want us to do now is have a look at a couple of different ways that I think both give us a conclusive answer on who that Comforter, or as the Greek word, which the word comforter comes from, parakletos, who that Comforter is. First, I want to begin with the immediate context. Now, all what you have to do is get a pen and paper in your own time and read chapter 14, especially these verses under a question. Put a heading Jesus, heading the Comforter, and everything Jesus said about himself, write it under Jesus, and about the Comforter, write it under the Comforter, and see what you will come up with. I've done that exercise myself, and here is what I've come up with. Jesus talking about himself in verse 19, he says, the world seeth me no more. Talking about the Comforter, he says, the world see him not, in verse 17, right? Talking about himself in verse 19, he says, but you see me, you, the disciples, the believers will see me. About the Comforter, but you know him. Jesus was with them at that time that he was speaking, right? And about the Comforter, he says, he, the Comforter, dwelleth with you, as in he is with you now, right now, right? About himself, Jesus says, I in you. That's in verse 20. About the Comforter, he says, he shall be in you. That's where Jesus says, I in you. In verse 20, he says, in that day, in the future, I will be in you, meaning. So it's the same thing, right? In verse 18, he says, I will come to you. I will not leave you comfortless or without a comforter. I will come to you. In verse 16, he says, I will give you another comforter. So which one is it? Are you going to give us another comforter, someone other than yourself? Or are you going to come to us, right? And In Matthew 28:19, Jesus says, "Lo, I am with you always, even unto the end of the world." In John chapter 14, talking about the Comforter, he says that he may abide with you forever, right? So just from this exercise alone, we understand that contextually, whatever Jesus said about the Comforter, he spoke about himself. In other words, Jesus was speaking in the third person, right? He was speaking in the third person about himself. Now, I will show you a bit later on that contextually, that dialogue, speech, for a lack of better word, nothing coming to my mind now, that Jesus was saying in John chapter 14, 15, and 16, he said, I spoke unto you in Proverbs. I will come to that. But from one perspective, one approach is contextually, the paracletos, or the Comforter, is none else other than Jesus himself. Whatever he said about the Comforter, he said about himself. In other words, Jesus was speaking about himself in the third person. Now, if that is not good enough to you, again, you can do that. You can do this exercise by yourself. Just look up the Greek word that has been translated as Comforter in the Gospel of John, and you will find that is used, I believe, only 4 or 5 times in the New Testament, and all of them by the Apostle John himself, right? Now, I will put them here on the screen for you. In that dialogue in John chapter 14, 15, and 16, he says, I'll pray the Father, and he shall give you another Comforter. In John 15, he says, but when the Comforter is come. In John 16, he says, nevertheless, I'll tell you the truth, it is expedient for you that I go away, for if I go not away, the Comforter will not come unto you. Now, in all these verses, the word Comforter is or comes from parakletos, right? The Greek word is parakletos, which is translated as Comforter. Before I show you the next time this word is used, allow me to show you what he says a few verses later in chapter 16. Okay, well, it's not here. All right, I'll come back to it. I'll come back to this screen. Let me share the Bible with you and show you on the Bible so you can see it for yourself. In chapter 16, in John chapter 16, he said like 3 or 4 times so far about the Comforter. Notice what he says in verse 25. He says, before I read it, allow me to highlight a couple of things. I'm assuming that the one who's listening is familiar with the context, but maybe you're not. So allow me to highlight a couple of things, right? When the disciples wondered at what Jesus was saying in verse 18, notice what we read. They said, what is this that he says, a little while we cannot tell what he's saying? And Jesus said, do you inquire among yourself a little while and you shall see me, and again a little while you shall not see me? And he says you're going to weep, and so forth. And eventually he came down to verse 25, where he says, these things have I spoken unto you in Proverbs, but the time cometh when I shall no more speak unto you in Proverbs, but I shall show you plainly from the Father. Now, 2 things I want to highlight, 2 very important things I want to highlight from this text. The first thing is that Jesus was speaking in Proverbs, meaning another translation, Bible translation, has it as dark sayings, not very clear, in a way that the meaning is hidden, right? And that's what I said. That's why I said he was speaking in the third person. So that's important to keep in mind as you're reading that context. But however, notice what he says.
Imad, sorry, before you go ahead.
Yeah.
I actually have a translation. I'm not sure if you have this one. It's the English majority text version. It's EMTV. It's not with you, right?
No, I don't have it. Would you like to read it?
I just want to read how it states here. It says, these things I have spoken to you in figures of speech. Mm-hmm. And why I mentioned that is because figures of speech, anyone who knows English and have studied English at school will know that even the very phrase third person is a figure of speech. So and you here, Righty, it's Proverbs here, dark sayings and so forth. So no, go ahead. I just wanted to point that out. It's fine.
No, thank you for that. Thank you. Figures of speech is a very good way to translate it, which highlights the point that we are making. Now, that's the first thing I want to highlight from this text. The second thing I want to highlight is that time cometh, Jesus says, when I shall no more speak unto you in Proverbs, but I shall show you plainly of the Father. Now, unless you're familiar with the context, you will miss it. Notice what he says few verses earlier in verse 13. He says, howbeit when he, the Spirit of truth, is come, he, the Spirit of truth, will guide you into all truth, for he shall not speak of himself, but whatsoever he shall hear, that shall he speak, and he will show you things to come. Are you following me? When he was speaking in figures of speech, he said the time come when he, the comforter, the Spirit of truth, he will show you things to come. Then down few verses later, when he says, okay, look, I was talking to you in Proverbs, but time will come when I will no more speak unto you Proverbs, but I shall show you plainly of the Father. So hang on a second. Is it you who are going to show us, or he, the comforter? Are you following my point?
Yes.
That verse clearly shows us that time will come when Jesus himself, he will teach us. So when he said that the comforter, he will teach you, that was speaking in figures of speech in the third person. And what it actually means is, I will teach you, which he said plainly few verses later. Just like he said, I will send you another comforter. Then he says, I will not leave you comfortless. I will come to you. So if you just have a surface reading of the text, you might accept what Pastor Boris is saying and what many Trinitarians are saying. It's a third separate being. But if you actually dig deeper into it and try to understand what Jesus is saying, pay attention to everything Jesus is saying in that context, it is very clear. Jesus speaking about himself in the third person. Now, with that said, allow me to finish the point that I was making, and I will stop there. Going back to my PowerPoint, I told you that the word paracletus means comforter, and John is the only gospel writer who actually is the only New Testament writer who uses the term paracletus or comforter. And we see in here in John chapter 14, 15, and 16, John recording the words of Jesus, referring to the Holy Spirit as the comforter, as paracletos, right? But notice what John writes in his first letter. In 1 John chapter 2 and verse 1, he says, my little children, these things write I unto you, that ye sin not. And if any man sin, we have an advocate or a paracletos or a comforter with the Father, Jesus Christ the righteous. So contextually, when you compare the sayings of Jesus in John chapter 14, it becomes clear that Jesus was speaking in the third person, and the comforter is none other than Jesus himself. When you examine the term comforter that is only used few times in the New Testament, you will see that the writer of the Gospel of John, John himself, identifies to us very plainly, very clearly, unmistakably who the comforter or the paracletus is. It is none else than Jesus Christ the righteous, right? So going back to Pastor Bohr's verse or analysis of John chapter 14 and verse 16, I might as well share it here so you can see it, where, and I will pray the Father, and he shall give you another comforter, that he may abide with you forever. Yes, three are mentioned there, but the actual context, the actual writer of the gospel makes it very clear who this other comforter is. It is none else than Jesus Christ himself. Don't let the word another put you off, right? Another simply means in another form, right? It doesn't have to mean another person. I mean, there's an example in the Old Testament where Samuel told Saul, you'll prophesy and you'll become another man. It didn't mean that Saul became Bob. No. Saul took upon himself a different spirit, a different demeanor, a different mentality, because the Spirit of God came upon him. So that's another comforter, means another of the same kind, right? Or in a same form, of a different form, rather, same of a different form. Anyway, I'll leave it at that, and I'll back to you, Virgil.
All right, so Imad, thank you so much for clarifying that. I think many people are unaware that it is only John who actually records this discourse between Christ and his disciples. So John chapter 14 and 15 and 16, even up to 17, is only recorded in the book of John. And why I say that is because even the very prayer that Jesus prays for in John chapter 14, he says, I will pray the Father. Many people are also unaware that that prayer is actually recorded in chapter 17, when Jesus prays and he says to his Father, John 17 and verse 21, he, for instance, says, Father, thou in me, I in you, and they in us. And so the question may be, how does this all happen? So yeah, again, it's John chapter 17, verse 21. And so for those of you who actually want the prayer of Jesus, the one that he prayed for in John 14, verse 16, the one Pastor Bo is talking about, I will pray the Father. The prayer is actually recorded here. And if it's interesting, Imad, if you read this entire chapter, this prayer, you don't find anything about a third person or a third being. You find God, you find Jesus, and you find us. So, or at least in this case, the disciples. Verse 21 says, that they may all be one, as thou, Father, art in me, and I in thee, that they also may be one in us, that the world may believe that thou hast sent me. So if ever there was some sort of Trinity, it would have been the Father, the Son, and us, and us being one. I don't know if you follow what I'm trying to say.
I am following, Virgil. And just to make a point in here, that once the identity of the Paracletus or Comforter is identified, you have to keep that in mind as you go through the chapter, John chapter 14, 15, and 16, because you will come across a few other verses that I'm sure Pastor Bohr in his presentation have used, and many Trinitarians use. Oh, look, this and this and this. Yes, that is true. But they all, if you've watched our video, they all have the same meaning. There's only one Comforter, one Paracletus. So once the identity of the Paracletus is identified, I guess apply to all the other verses.
It will definitely help. So Imad, thank you again for giving your explanation there.